security of the network. And for us, security is important. And also what's important for us is to be able to go through the application process in a fast manner and in a manner that helps to support the timelines and timeframes for our investments. So those that from a subsea cable perspective, we are definitely focused on on supporting policies that allow for the fast review of applications. We also believe it's important for, oftentimes with the subsea cable review, you have to, there are a number of government stakeholders that may be working on the issue. And so it remains important for there to be a seamless way for information to be shared amongst those stakeholders. And when that information needs to be confidential, that's important to make sure that it's confidential as well. But the seamless sharing of information, at least from our perspective, is important. The other thing that I will also say on subsea cables is that in addition to the owners of the cable, there are other parties that have capacity on those cables that that utilize those cables and that also light fiber. To the extent that there's interest in understanding those parties, we would suggest that it's important to deal with those parties directly and not have sort of the owners stand in the middle to try to navigate that information. So just want to touch on subsea cables there, and then just bringing up the rear, we'll touch on telecom and AI. Wow. From our perspective, one of the important things, one of the important balances to strike when dealing with AI and telecom, at least on the service side, not so much the network side, but on the service side, is to make sure that as these AI solutions are developed, that policymakers strike the right balance with privacy and wiretap laws. It's just going to be important to sort of navigate those two areas as AI solutions are developed for consumers. The other thing that we routinely flag when we talk about AI and telecom is that particularly with the TCPA, which has prohibitions on the use of pre-recorded voices, we also flag the importance of making sure that folks who use assistive technologies, folks who have disabilities and may leverage pre-recorded voices in the future via AI, it's important that they have the ability, there are exemptions that allow those technologies to continue to evolve and allow disabled consumers to use those technologies. So with that said.
Great. Michael, why don't you jump in?
Okay. Well, it's like Paula, I'd like to circle back and maybe, you may know me from my FCC days, but before that I spent 20 years on Capitol Hill, and in 2005 I was leading the charge with my old boss on VoIP legislation, and that was to kick the heck out of the old FCC. Kevin Martin had screwed up the world. And we were trying to correct it and lay down some tracks that actually became kind of some of the framework for what exists today for the regulatory treatment of VoIP. Everything circles back. I'm now before you again, 20 some odd years later. My old boss is running for the Senate again. So maybe I'll return to that weight that I was that many years ago. But a couple things to Glenn's question. And then I'm going to talk a couple of policy issues. But to Glenn's question, we've had 3-member commissions before for short periods of time. The work still gets done. You plow through. We've had 4-member commissions. I tend to think this looks like to be how it's going to stay for a while. The next administration may have a different approach. I don't know if it changes that much until the minority commissioner, or a minority commissioner, I should say, decides to play hardball and decide not to show up for quorum. It doesn't really matter for the items themselves. They still can process them. They have enough for quorum, and then you go from there. They'll win, they'll lose, so be it. But if they decide to sit out, well, then you got a problem. And I tend to believe that 5 makes more sense. There's always a great likelihood, and you see this in many organizations. I worked in the staff in the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House. There's a couple kooks, and it just takes one kook to be on the FCC to really bottle things up. And I'm not saying the current ones are, but this just takes one. And so you have a couple others, you can kind of work around it. If you only got 3 and you count, if someone wants to play hardball and just disappear and go to the Bahamas for a while, you're in a bad situation. So I tend to think the 5 makes more sense, but that's not my call. And obviously this administration has a different viewpoint, so be it. But I don't think it alters the dynamics. I had a chance to interview Olivia Trustee, the Republican commissioner, and she seems to think that work is just plowing ahead forward as it is, not too problematic. She's never lived with 5 members, so it's not that different for her. So I think it's just the way we're going to be for a while. On a couple of policy issues, on what Glenn and I talked about, what are we working on? So I'm spending a great deal of time on the issue of consent, and I know you're going to have a panel on consent. I've worked on behalf of a number of people on an FCC petition to clarify a particular issue, and that is on the quiet hours. There's a block of time that you can't, the legitimate companies, well, any company can't market, can't comment, can't solicit to consumers, the hours are supposed to be left alone kind of scenario, except if you have express consent from the consumers. Well, we have a couple creative lawyers, and 2 in particular, or at least one firm in Florida, that has written out the last part of the equation. And they are of the mind that the quiet hour periods are sacrosanct, and you as a consumer do not have the ability to waive them, and that providers that contact you on your behalf and ask you maybe reach out. I remember as a new parent, that's been a number of years, but I would reach out late at night because the only time I had in my day, late at night I would order diapers. That was a big thing in my house. And I'm ordering diapers, and I wanted to save as much money as I can. I work for the federal government, made no money. Great. You ask for the code, they can't send it to you because it's quiet hour period. Well, if you have consent, not a problem. Here, the lawyers are saying, nope, it's sacrosanct, and every time that you violate that, it's a class action, and we're going to sue the heck out of the companies, and that's where we are. We're, I think, almost 500 lawsuits, and one of the biggest trends in TCPA lawsuits this is the last couple of years. It's a huge problem, and as we have a petition before the commission basically has already decided this issue, and all we're asking for is to restate the truth. And to close down this avenue. And TCPA has, with the right intent, I've had to live with it for all my career. It has blessings of what it wanted to do, and it has a number of unintended consequences. And we live with those unintended consequences every day. And the class action lawsuits are just so problematic. And what it has fed is that a number of state TCPAs are growing. States are building their own TCPAs, and they're going to conflict with the federal TCPA, and they're going to conflict with their other state TCPAs. And so you're going to have this patchwork of how the heck are you supposed to serve as a legitimate company, a legitimate brand. How can you market to your customers, to your potential customers? How can you offer services under such a situation? And it's not even, and I gave a speech recently, it's not about finding the lowest common ground. So like whoever makes the worst statute, we can follow that. Because the laws will be written so many different ways, they're going to fight each other, and you're going to get sued inevitably. So that's a big problem, and something I've been working on and testifying in a number of different states, going state by state. Please don't do this. It is incredibly harmful. Learn from the federal mistakes and learn from the federal approach. The federal government has, the FCC, I was there. We moved from a universe of trying to penalize legitimate marketers. We still do that, unfortunately. But instead, we've moved towards, as Paula indicated, stir shaking, a technological solution to provide a better alternative as a way to get to the traffic issue, rather than trying to punish and basically profitize a number of particular law firms that just make this as their only way to make money. So that's going to continue. Unfortunately, and as we have a number of court decisions, the court decisions, have gone on TCPA, have gone basically on the marketer's direction, where you could see, there's going to come a point when a lot of the FCC regulations could be stricken from the books because they aren't expressly required by Congress. They aren't in the statute. They are add-ons to the commission patched on with no authority in the early 2000s, that are and before them that are really problematic. And so as people get more frustrated with this, you're going to have an effort to try and rip those down, and then we're going to be in a whole mess where everyone's looking at each other saying there are no rules. We got to get these terrible telemarketers, terrible. I should have specified earlier. I'm working more on the commercial texting side of the equation, not on the voice side equation, but it's still the same. And there's going to be a universe where we're going to have to address this unless we can get some sensible acknowledgement here from the commission and others. How do we deal with that legitimate companies trying to serve legitimate consumers are allowed to move forward and not be subject to penalized lawsuits. The second issue that I'll bring to your attention, and it plays right into Glenn's comment, I'm going to put it as a big category because it flows from a number of things, is preemption. And whether it's, I spend a deal of time on AI preemption, I'm also working on VoIP preemption. I think it's time that we finalize the VoIP preemption. California is incredibly problematic. We should not even, I can't comprehend that we're still having this debate. In honesty, I tried when I was at the commission to codify a number of things where, the Pulver decision is still kind of tentative, and I tried to get the commission to codify that and really be more clear and specify, because how they determine certain things, the mixed jurisdiction and X, Y, Z. I won't bore you with that, but I tried, and there just wasn't as much appetite from my colleagues for that issue, sadly, and I spent a lot of capital trying to make that happen. And it's something we're going to have to deal with. And so I think it's preemption on that front as well. I mentioned the TCPAs. We're going to have to deal with preemption on telemarketing and commercial texting. So there's a number of universes in the preemption universe. We have to acknowledge that certain communications goes back to the fundamental premise of a number of the services that you're part of. It is interstate communications. I'm sorry that it's not a local or a state issue. It's not my problem or my fault. I didn't make it that way, but the law and the authority and the jurisdiction breaks down based on on who has authority, and the federal government has authority under the U.S. Constitution over interstate commerce, and this is interstate commerce. And the FCC and Congress is going to have to step forward and say, yes, this is our matter. And states, I'm really sorry. It's disappointing that you can't do more here, but you're just not going to be able to. Go find something fun to do. Go balance your budgets. Go build some highways. Do whatever you want, but don't do this. They seem to say, oh, AI. Everyone wants to do something on AI. You've got 1,000 bills on AI in state houses across the country. 1,000. All of them doing all kinds of goofy things. That's not sustainable. And you say, well, if California comes up with a good model, we'll copy that. No one's copying anything, and no one acknowledges that California is incredibly flawed in how they've approached things. So we're going to need preemption. Everyone hates the P word. I've said that many times. I testified to that. But it is necessary, and it ruffles feathers. But you have to be willing to do sound policy if we want to get somewhere on technology.
Thank you. Angie.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Angie Kronenberg, and I have my own consulting firm. I've been in the tech and telecom space for over 30 years. I was in private practice. I was at the FCC during the Obama administration, advising Commissioner Clyburn. Worked on the National Broadband Plan, the first major effort to do USF high cost reform and ICC reform. And then I left her office to go head up the policy shop at a large industry association representing competitive providers, so many companies like yourselves. Really happy to be here today, and Glenn asked me to talk about two things. So one is the potential for USF reform, so the Universal Service Fund, which I'm sure many of you are aware of, and then also the current status of the efforts of NTIA to implement what is called the BEAD program, which is intended to deliver broadband technology to every consumer in the United States. So those that are considered unserved and those that are considered underserved. As many of you are aware, it's been the US policy to deliver broadband capabilities to consumers for a very long time. It started before 2010 when Congress asked the FCC to put together a national broadband plan. The FCC did that, then went through a number of implementations in USF to change the programs so that they weren't just supporting telephone service, but actually supporting the availability and affordability of broadband services. During the National Broadband Plan, the FCC told Congress, like, it's gonna take a really long time to deliver broadband technology to every consumer in rural America unless you give us additional money to make that happen. And it really took COVID, almost 10 plus years later, to kind of wake up Congress to realize that having children trying to do remote learning in the Taco Bell and McDonald's parking lots is not a great way to ensure that we're best meeting the needs of Americans during the middle of a crisis. And so we saw bipartisan Congress really come together and decide that they were going to put significant amounts of money into the delivery of broadband technology across the US. And that was a really great thing to happen, but it's taken a significant period of time in order for us to begin to see the money flow. The BEAD program itself, the Trump administration came in and they really wanted to make it happen fast and quickly. They changed the policies to ensure that all technologies would have an opportunity to obtain money through the BEAD program. Most of BEAD is actually being implemented at the state and territory level. So NTIA is playing an important administrative role in setting the policies and ensuring that the statute is being met. But it's really the states who are working with the providers in their states to deliver that technology. And what we're beginning to see this year is, significant improvements in the program to get the money out really quickly. But there's some concerns that some of the technologies may not be able to meet the long-term needs of communities. So I think we will begin to see how that plays out as the money and the technology gets rolled out. And in the meantime, in USF, what we're seeing is a very significant contribution factor. So while the FCC did a lot of reforms of the various programs in USF, so there's a high cost program that supports rural broadband companies' delivery of technology and operations of their systems. There's also the E-rate program, which provides subsidized service to schools and libraries, which largely supports broadband technology and broadband services now. And then there's a rural healthcare program. It's the smallest program, and it delivers affordable broadband services to rural hospitals and clinics. And then there's also the Lifeline program, which still largely supports voice service, but it's a very small amount monthly, and consumers can use it to purchase their broadband service in addition to their voice service. So the USF program has the biggest outstanding issue in USF is that the contribution factor is currently at its highest rate. It's 38.1%. What we've seen happen in USF is that it is supported by interstate and international telecom revenues that has declined over time as people are using new technologies to obtain their communication services. And while the FCC did advise in the National Broadband Plan that we needed to expand the contribution base in some way, do some kind of contribution reform, and the FCC did issue an NPRM before I left the FCC back in 2013 timeframe, where they were looking at how they would do contribution reform, and they put a couple of ideas into the record, and people commented on it. So one was to include broadband revenues into the base. Another was to completely change the way we do contributions and look at connections. So they asked about broadband connections and voice connections. And then they also, talked about just changing the system so that we would put a fee on numbers. And so those were what was in the record. And a number of things happened. The joint board was asked to weigh in on how to do contribution reform. Years passed. There wasn't a lot of I would say agreement in the record about how to move forward, and there wasn't a significant, you always kind of need a champion at the FCC to want to do something, and we didn't really have a champion at the FCC who's like, hey, let's do this, let's figure out how to essentially tax whatever we're going to tax to change the contribution factor. As we all know, most politicians don't typically want to raise taxes in any way, right? So you start to touch that third rail, it becomes a problem politically. But in the not too distant past, we did have one commissioner who's now chair of the FCC who was very interested in large technology companies paying into the USF in a more significant way than what they currently do, and I wouldn't call it a plan, but put some ideas forward that really kind of generated some support in the industry to begin to look at the large tech companies and their use of broadband technologies and potentially paying some significant amount of their revenues into USF to pay for it. In the meantime, as part of the Infrastructure Act, we also had a significant program that was implemented called the Affordable Connectivity Program, which was really important at the time and really in many ways still is, but it no longer exists. So ACP was helping low-income families with a significant amount of money to pay for broadband service. That lasted essentially through COVID, a little bit past COVID, and that program ran out of money. It had been a program that Congress had set aside a significant amount, over $7 billion towards, but we ran out of the money. Congress did not renew the program. And what we've seen is some decline in broadband connectivity for low-income families as a result of that. So between the high contribution factor that has continued to go up, as well as the disappearance of the ACP, we saw a group in Congress who was like, you know what, we really do need to look at these issues and address these issues. And I saw that as a really great thing. It was bipartisan. It started in the Senate, and then they started to work with House members as well, House leaders as well, to look at USF reform. And that effort, they took comments in, they had lots of ideas. They never did publish their ideas in the last Congress, and in the meantime, we changed Congresses, we have some new leadership. They continued on with their working group, and they recently asked for comments on how to do USF reform, and they did get some significant input. They have not published all the comments, but some organizations did make their comments publicly available. I managed to find about 30 of them and went through them, and I'd make a couple of observations about where we are as a matter of, is there any alignment on how people can agree about how to go about USF reform, and what do we do about families that need help to afford broadband technology? And not shockingly, there's not a ton of agreement in the record. There still seems to be quite a divide between those who really want to see the very large companies pay a lot more into USF as compared to the trade associations that tend to represent the large ISPs, right? Like there just is a divide between the large technology associations as well as the large ISP associations. So that's not surprising that there seems to be that significant divide. No one has really put forward the plan of how you would exactly go after large technology companies. There appears to be some effort to really focus on digital advertising revenue. The FCC today doesn't have jurisdiction over digital advertising revenue, and while that may have been something that Chairman Carr was interested in doing, he most recently indicated in front of the Rural Broadband Association that he has very limited authority. So I think he's signaling that it would be better for Congress to take this up and do something about it. Then the other motivating factor to do reform is to create a more robust low-income program, because Lifeline, doesn't really pay that much. So how do we essentially replace the affordable connectivity program? The political problem that I see right now is we're headed into an election year, and it's so hard for Congress to do major reforms of programs when they have elections coming up next year. And while they are, it's great that they took these comments in, it's hard to see them doing a hearing. It's hard to see, you have to do it, and you know this better, Mike, than many of us in this room. When you want something to pass Congress, there's an element of education, making sure the staff understands all the ins and outs, and that their bosses understand all the ins and outs. And then there's the political deal making, right, that has to happen to make things get introduced and then actually pass Congress. And that's usually a give and take process. And that's what we saw in the 96 Act. There were companies that were gaining a lot. They may be giving up some things, but they were also gaining a lot. So it's we need that push and pull to all come together. And it's hard to see how that's going to come together in 2026. And in the meantime, okay, so the FCC does have some jurisdiction. They have jurisdiction over these programs. What can they do to potentially address the high contribution factor, how can they ensure consumers are not being overburdened by the factor? And this is where it kind of gets interesting because you have a chairman of the FCC who's really interested in deregulatory efforts, right? And even described in front of the World Broadband Association, there's still room for efficiencies in this program, and I would agree with that. And what struck me about the comments that I saw in front of the Hills Working Group was that there were center groups, left groups, and right groups that were all saying to Congress, you need to do like deep dives into these programs and figure out like where there potentially is waste that we could address to help lower the contribution factor. And there have been some ideas. There are some things that are even left over from the 2011 order that the FCC has not finished implementing. And so one organization, ITI, pointed out there's about $1 billion worth of savings that the USF could achieve almost immediately. Things that the commission had already, sought comment on that they could act on. So it'll be interesting to see if the chairman really wants to go there. And I think a lot of it will depend on the pressure, if the telecom revenues continue to decline and the contribution factor gets higher and higher, if they can't ratchet it down in some way by using revenues that USAC just hangs on to for appeals purposes. I think there could be some pressure on him to do something.
Right. Jonathan, take us home.
Hi, everyone. Jonathan Mark. Currently at Google. Before Google, I was at a law firm in the telecom practice and at the FCC as an honors attorney. As a lot of my fellow panelists have already mentioned, I'm really interested in AI policy, the FCC's efforts, but also efforts at the states as well. I think it would be helpful. I know there's a panel on AI right after this, but to kind of quickly summarize what the FCC has done in the AI space to bring us to today. Initially, the FCC issued a declaratory ruling stating that voices generated by artificial intelligence qualify as pre-recorded artificial voices under the TCPA. The FCC also released a notice of inquiry and a notice of proposed rulemaking in the AI space to introduce consent and disclosure requirements for when AI voices are used in a call. As you know, robocalling is one of the top issues at the FCC. Consumers are plagued with this. So while it's good to see action in the space to protect consumers from unwanted calls, we really have to strike a balance to allow the technology to be innovative to benefit consumers in new ways. Some of that is AI scam detection features on phones. What will be permissible, and will the FCC or state governments, as Paula mentioned, wiretapping laws in various states, will they prohibit those kind of uses that could protect certain, especially vulnerable communities? I'm thinking about the elderly, or those who English might not be their first language. There are plenty of scams that are perpetrated through AI, but AI also has promised to protect consumers from unwanted fraud. Another thing I wanted to mention, I think if to date the FCC has not done any action on that notice of proposed rulemaking in 2025, so in 2026 we're looking to see if the FCC does adopt some final rules. If the last 2 years were generative AI being the hot topic, I think in 2026 we can look to agentic AI. And so let's look at innovative features that might roll out on consumer devices and by various companies on their network for agentic calling, the ability for users to complete certain tasks with AI. How does that look? And so we're really following regulation of the FCC and the state in that space to strike the right balance to protect consumers from unwanted calls, but also to allow these new innovative use cases. Another thing Glenn mentioned earlier, this FCC has been really focused on supply chain issues. And so to the extent that your company or any part of your network is involved with an entity on the FCC's covered list, or even an entity that might be added, certain entities from China, it's really important to do a second look at your vendors and those contracts to understand whether any of that equipment or any of those services are a part of your network, because if you don't address it today, it will be a problem for tomorrow. I know we might be at time, so I don't want to go over. How are we? Okay. And then one other thing that we've been looking at is KYC, know your customer, efforts of the FCC to acquire some kind of enhanced verification of customers, again, to address the problem of robocalling. We saw a very large fine earlier this year in that space, but I think companies are still looking to see like what more is required, what is sufficient. In the industry, so we'll be looking to see how different players in the space enhance their KYC efforts and further articulation from the FCC on what is sufficient.
Thank you. So we are out of time, and to be respectful to everyone's busy schedule.